Hey everybody, welcome to the Least of These podcast. My name is John Jackson, and today I want to talk about something that's been stirring up a lot of conversation again lately. Especially after President Trump posted his updated immigration plans on X. And let me just say this right from the start. I get and I understand why this topic is so emotional for people. You see, immigration is actually one of the biggest challenges our country is facing right now. The border is a mess. The vetting process is inconsistent. And yes, there are real ideological threats in this world that we are facing as a country, including but not limited to Islamic extremism that we absolutely have to take seriously. And so I understand the instinct to want order, to want security, to want clarity about who's coming in and what they believe, right? Every nation has that responsibility. And biblically speaking, that's actually part of stewarding justice. But the problem that I'm seeing is when we turn to voices like Steven Crowder, for example, to help us think through all of this, and I fear when we do that, what we actually end up with isn't clarity at all. It's actually confusion. Because instead of dealing with the real concerns, right, that we are facing as a country, instead what he does is he mixes those concerns with broad brush claims and demographic fear and just commentary that I feel honestly tells you more about his worldview than about the issues that we're facing as a country themselves. And so in this video, I actually want to walk through a few moments from his recent video, not to dunk on him and not to pretend that the immigration problem isn't a real problem, but rather to show you how the way he frames these conversations actually shapes the way that people think. Because if you listen closely, you'll start to notice a pattern. And that pattern affects people far more than the immigration problem that we're facing today. It affects how we view people, how we view groups and cultures, and ultimately how we view human worth. And so before we go any further, I actually want to start with something Crowder says at the very beginning of his video. And honestly, this is where a lot of people are probably going to just nod along without really realizing what's tucked inside of the argument that he's making. And so here's what Steven Crowder had to say.
I'll often hear people say too, like, it's because the Jews control our government or Israel. And so they encourage open borders. And so really that's the head of the beast. And Donald Trump is controlled by them. That's why we have so much immigration. It doesn't pass the reason test, though. He may not be perfect. This is more than any president has ever done to curb Islamic immigration in this country, period. Is that a factual statement? Comment. I'm not saying it's enough. He's done more than any other president in our lifetime to curb Islamic immigration, period. Is that a factual statement?
I think it is a factual statement, and I think that a lot of people would be mad about it.
Yes.
It's a factual that we're happy. It's like the segment we do. We're saying the same thing,
right?
Except they're mad about it. They're like, "Hey, what are you doing? We want these these Muslims here."
No, I think that's a great point, Josh. If he wasn't over the target on this, then he wouldn't see so many of the people on the left or people affected in these communities speaking out against what he's doing.
Right.
Obviously, he's doing something right.
And you know what I see? I see a lot of support on this from observant Jewish Americans.
Yeah.
So this is one of those things where people go, the biggest issue, hold on a second. One of the biggest issues to me certainly is immigration. And I think Islamic immigration is a big part of it. Why? Because we need to be able to pick the kind of country we live in. And one of the levers that you can pull that can sort of result in something that is quantifiable is immigration policy. You can say, what kind of country do we not want to look like? Yemen, Sudan, Afghanistan. We're not bringing in people from there. It's one of the things that can be done and has not been done by previous presidents. Matter of fact, you hear the rhetoric quite a bit from those on the left who want to push this lie of the mosaic multiculturalism. According to people like Tim Walz and Somalis themselves, it's not you, it's actually them, Somali immigrants, who are the backbone of Minnesota.
All right, so I want you to notice how fast Crowder shifts from talking about legitimate security concerns to talking about something much broader, right? Essentially, he argues that we need to be able to pick the kind of country that we want to live in, which is actually true in a very general sense, right? Every nation has the right to manage immigration or to screen for potential threats or to protect its citizens. All of that is just common sense. But then he collapses entire people groups into, the religious ideology he disagrees with, right? He talks about countries like Yemen and Sudan and Afghanistan. And again, he's not talking about individuals at this point. He's not talking about refugees fleeing violence. He's not talking about families trying to survive, but rather he's talking about whole populations, as if every single person from these countries represents the same existential threat, right? The same ideology, the same worldview. And, I actually want to be fair here. You see, yes, there are real dangers associated with Islamic extremism. As Christians, we know far too well that consistent Islam leads to some deeply destructive ideas like, violent jihad, for example, or oppressive legalism, or the denial of Christ. All of those things are really horrible from a Christian perspective. But you see, not every Muslim is a jihadist. Not every Muslim family is an extremist family. And actually, many of them are simply fleeing the very things that Crowder is describing here. Many of them are moderate. Many are just cultural Muslims with no interest in exporting Sharia law. And I believe that if we don't distinguish between an ideology and the individuals who may or may not consistently be practicing it, then I think at that point, we're not thinking clearly. Instead, what we're doing is just reacting emotionally. And here's the bigger issue, in my opinion. You see, if Crowder really believed the logic that he's using here, he wouldn't stop with Islam, right? Mormon theology is also radically opposed to Christianity. It also includes, things like false revelation, a false Christ, and a track record of polygamy that absolutely would destabilize society if it was widely embraced. And guess what? Mormonism is growing too. And yet Crowder doesn't argue that we should block Mormons from immigrating. And why? Well, it's because he instinctively knows you can't govern a pluralistic nation by banning everyone whose religious beliefs that you think are harmful, right? We don't do that with Mormons. We don't do that with atheists, even though, interestingly enough, atheism has arguably produced far more cultural and societal decay in the West than Islam ever has, especially in the advent of the Enlightenment era, right? But that's neither here nor there. And that's exactly the point. See, if you follow Crowder's reasoning all the way to his logical conclusion, the only consistent system that you would be left with is actually a rigid hardline Christian nationalism where only Christians, and you got to define what Christians you're talking about, or the people who perfectly emulate the type of Christian norm that you want to be emulated, are allowed to enter the country, right? But we don't live in a theocracy. We live in a democratic republic. We have what's called freedom of religion. And even Crowder would defend that. You see, the goal shouldn't be to police every belief system that we disagree with. The goal is to protect the country from real threats without erasing the individuality, the dignity, or the complexity of entire people groups. And that's the distinction his argumentation refuses to make. And so that's the first issue that we saw from the first clip. But now let's move on to the second clip, because this is where I think Crowder's argument really starts to shift from, people should assimilate to our culture, which, again, most Americans already agree with, to something far more revealing, right? Here's what he had to say.
And I do love to see that President Trump, again, yesterday, this is very different from other presidents. He understands that you have the right to pick the country you want to live in. He doubled down on the ban.
How long does your administration plan to pause asylum into the U.S.?
I think a long time.
Can you give any kind of time?
We don't want those people. We have enough problems. We don't want those people.
Is that a year, 2 years?
No time limit.
Whatever.
Different countries. are not friendly to us, and countries that are out of control themselves. Countries like Somalia that have virtually no government, no military, no police. All they do is go around killing each other. Then they come into our country and tell us how to run our country.
It's, and I want to get to not just Somalia, but other countries here. The left wants you to act as though we're not aware of emulation, as though that hasn't been how all civilizations have been brought into, well, really modern civilization ever, or it's the only way that civilizations that were behind have improved, right? It's looking at the civilization, looking at the nation that does it right, and making your country, make it look like the picture. Emulation. And instead, we have these people coming from these countries where there's female mutilation, where there's beheadings for leaving Islam, where there's dhimmitude, where there's gross violations of human rights, where there's been no progress, where there's no running water. The left wants you to look at those nations and say, hey, we're all equal. And it's really this simple. They come here, anyone who comes here emulates what we've done here. And we don't want a nation or people from a nation that has nothing worthy of emulation. In other words, if we don't see anything that we would want to copy from you, then we don't want to bring people from there. You want to come here, then you need to copycat, mimic what we do here to be welcome here. Otherwise, we emulate crap.
All right, so as you can see, Crowder begins this clip by praising Donald Trump for essentially doubling down on his immigration stance. And then he plays a clip of Donald Trump describing Somalia immigrants, coming from crime-ridden third world countries, and then supposedly telling us how to run our country. And already we're dealing with framing that lumps entire, people groups together. You see, unfortunately, Trump isn't talking about individual Somali criminals or extremists here. No, he's actually just talking about Somalians as a whole. And that's already its own problem. And so, but what's even more unfortunate is that Crowder actually picks up on this rhetoric and then he could just runs with it. But then Crowder does something even more interesting. He says that the people who come here should emulate our culture, our values, our societal norms. Now, on its face, that's completely reasonable, as I've already pointed out in this video. If you move to a country, you need to learn the language. You need to respect its laws. You need to embrace the basic societal expectations that that country has, right? That's just basic common sense, right? That's how any society holds itself together. And so Crowder has a point there. However, the contradiction comes in when he issues his very next breath, right? Because after arguing that immigrants should assimilate when they arrive, he then shifts the goalposts, if you caught this. And he says that, well, we shouldn't even let them in unless their entire country already looks like the place that we would want to emulate. In other words, it's not enough for the individual immigrant to assimilate to America whenever they get over here. No, their entire nation of origin must already reflect American cultural values way before they're allowed to enter the country, way before they're allowed to be placed in the immigration process. And so as you can see, that's where I think that his logic just completely begins to break down, because not everyone has the power to shape their government. Right? Not everyone controls their nation's military or their education system or their infrastructure, right? This is common sense, right? Many people are fleeing those failures. They're not trying to recreate them. But you see, Crowder doesn't acknowledge that, right? He treats the entire population of, let's say, Somalia or Afghanistan. He treats all of them as a monolith, as if every person from a poor or unstable nation carries that nation's dysfunction deeply inside of them. And that's a problem. And, interestingly enough, this is where the CRT comparison matters. You see, one of the main things that Crowder and many other white people, for that matter, criticized about CRT is that it reduced white people to systems that they didn't personally create, right? It created individuals as though they were responsible for the worst parts of their society simply because of the group that they belong to. But here, guess what? Crowder's doing the exact same thing. It's just in the opposite direction, right? He collapses every immigrant from a third world country into the failings of that said country's government, right? Its corruption and its crimes, right? He treats them as if they all share the same worldview, right? The same values, the same moral failures. But that's the very thing that he criticized BLM for doing in 2020, whenever they treated all white people as if they were all slave owners or a part of the KKK, etc. You name it. Do you see the hypocrisy yet? And you know, the irony of this situation is that, you know, he's not wrong to say that every culture needs some type of or some degree of common ground to function. Again, that is just common sense. But you see, the problem is that whenever he tries to combine a true principle with a false application, you see, when you do that, you end up with something deeply misleading. And in this case, that's exactly what we have, right? Steven Crowder took a valid idea, which was that people need to assimilate to the nation that they're coming to. And then what he did is he merged it with a sweeping dismissal of entire nations full of diverse human beings. And again, that's just sloppy logic. And worse, that's actually just demographic determinism. And it leads us directly into what we're about to see next in this next clip that we're about to see. You see, in this clip, we are about to see a moment where Crowder's concerns shift from ideology into something more visual. And honestly, I think this is where things get really, really revealing, in my opinion. And so here's the clip.
You go back and watch Moscow on the Hudson when they're talking about the United States, like, I want Coca-Cola, Lois Jeans, Macy's Parade. I'm using this to make a point. They looked at the United States and wanted to be a part of it. They came here and they spoke with an accent, but they were proud to be American. That doesn't look like those people. You, out. You need, if you want what you see in this country, take it back to your country. Start making it look like this picture, and maybe we'll talk about you being let in. Also, if you do that, you wouldn't want to be let in. You'd be perfectly fine from that previous nation. Let's go to another enclave. Again, this takes place nowhere in nature.
Enclave.
It's a policy. North Texas, between 2010 to 2020, the Indian population exploded. It's currently at 544,000. And of course, you also know about the Epic Center and you know about these constructions going on. Yeah. I can tell you that there are areas of Texas where if you are a white Texan, you are unwelcome and you are a stranger in your own neighborhood where you used to have block parties. There are parts of North Texas that are completely unrecognizable. This guy got doxxed for this, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
I believe that's Frisco, Texas, just north of Dallas.
Jeez.
And it even bleeds out to other areas in the state. My Costco, for example, they sell, I knew it was a problem when they started selling non-bread, which I buy sometimes.
It's tasty.
I'm not going to lie.
So,
every now and then I get some non-bread. But you know what? But we don't need the people. We'll take the unleavened bread. Again, this is okay. If you look at that and you go, but that doesn't look like America, that's okay. It's okay. Yeah. And it's not just culture. It is also religion. Race is a component. And really, it's semantics. You're just saying people from this area of the world, people who look like, sound like, practice like this, feel less American to me. That's okay. Because guess what? They would say the same thing about you in their neighborhood. It's okay. And you do have a choice. And people who say, no, that has no place in conservatism, well, guess what? They're wrong. They're wrong. And of course, it also does come down to individuals. You can find some people from some of these places, they're exceptions, and an exception doesn't prove the rule, who may in fact be proud to be American.
That used to be the way they let people come in.
Right.
They'd find the exceptions and then that person got approved.
You had to be exceptional.
Yeah.
Now let's look at the white population. Does that matter to you? Does it matter to you to have a significantly more white country than India? Because between 1950 and today, the non-white percent of the population the United States has tripled. 1950, the non-white population was 12.5%. Today, it's 42%. That's a different country. That's a different country. And I don't want to hear people bullshit you and say, oh, what about the Italians and the Irish and the Germans? And, they didn't view the Irish as white at one point, or the Italians. Shut up. Shut up. It's not the same as someone from South India. It's not. And we don't have the same cultural differences and problems that we have when people are coming from a country where one of their common holiday practices is to gang rape a water monitor lizard.
All right, so as you can see in this clip, Crowder is essentially surveying parts of Texas where the Indian population has grown significantly. And instead of discussing things like crime or ideology or even assimilation, which I thought that was the focus of his video, he instead focuses almost entirely on the way these communities look, right? He shows clips of, Indian families just walking down the street, shopping at grocery stores, just going about their normal life, really. There's no violence in this video. There's no extremism, nothing really alarming, to be honest with you. It's just Indian Americans doing what Indian Americans do. And yet he frames all of this as if that's a problem in and of itself, right? He jokes that even at his own Costco, they're now selling name bread, and then immediately says, well, we don't need the people. We'll just take the unleavened bread, please. Now, on the surface, I understand how many people will point to that remark as just, dark humor. They're saying, Janai, you're kind of being too serious. You need to just laugh a little. But I just need you to know that humor, even dark humor, always has a logic behind it, my friends. We can't be this simple-minded to not see that. And the logic behind this joke is absolutely clear. You see, the presence of these people is the issue. Not their behavior, not their values, not their politics. It's their presence, right? Then he says something even more direct, right? He tells his audience that if you see those communities and think, well, that doesn't look like America, he tells his audience that, it's okay to feel that way. And I want you to notice the audience that he's speaking to in that moment, right? He's not addressing Black Americans. He's not addressing Hispanic Americans. He's not even addressing Asian Americans. He's specifically addressing, by his own words, white Americans, as if whiteness is the default definition of American. And anything that visually departs from that is an intrusion of some sorts. Now, I know he tries to soften that by saying, well, they would feel the same way if you went into their own country. But my friends, I just need you to understand how that doesn't fix the logic, right? That just universalizes the ethnocentrism, right? That simply says, well, everyone does it, so I guess that means it's good. But we know the problem with that line of thinking now, don't we? We understand that that's just more relativism. And my mama used to tell me this all the time, and I absolutely love it. I'm use it when my child kind of grows up. She says, Janai, if your friend jumps off the bridge, are you going to jump too? And what she was essentially saying there was that just because you see a bunch of people doing something, that doesn't make it automatically a good thing. Like, we all know this. And so the question that we really should be asking ourselves is this: should we do that? Should we have this ethnocentric mindset? And the answer is obviously not. But then Crowder adds yet another layer, right? He says that while there might be some exceptions, those exceptions don't make the rule, which, in other words, for those who aren't tracking here, it basically implies that what the rule actually is that large non-white populations are inherently foreign. They are inherently disruptive. They're inherently un-American, unless proven otherwise. That's what the implication is there. And this is where his real argument begins to surface, because what Crowder is actually describing isn't immigration policy. It isn't border security. It isn't even assimilation at this point. Again, I thought that's what this video was going to be about, but obviously not, right? What it is that it's discomfort with the demographic change itself. right? It's the belief that America stops being America when too many non-white groups occupy a visible space, right? It's the anxiety of losing cultural dominance. That's what it is. And all it is just framed as concern for national identity or national security. But that's not really what's on Steven Crowder's mind here, right? And so as we're about to see, it is in this next clip that we're about to see all of the earlier hints, finally come to the surface, right? Everything that Steven Crowder has been implying so far about culture, about demographics, about who counts as American, all of that is about to start to take a more explicit shape. And you'll see what I mean once you see this clip.
You're surviving an invasion. An invasion. And is it completely fine? Well, Lee Kuan Yew, the father of Singapore, as he's referred to, said this about America. He said, multiculturalism will destroy. He kind of sounds like George Takei in my mind. Multiculturalism will destroy America. There is a danger that large numbers of Mexicans, oh my, and others will continue to come to the U.S. and spread their culture across the whole of the country. If they breed faster than the wasps and are living with them, whose culture will prevail? They will change each other, but it would be sad for American culture to be changed even partially. That's an outside observer going,
yeah,
it's good for the world for the United States to be what it is. And it's okay for you to think so. Doesn't mean no blacks. Doesn't mean no browns. I'll tell you this, black Americans, they have their own problems, obviously crime being chief amongst them. Brown Americans, Hispanic Americans were right there. We fought some wars with the people of Mexico, just to be clear. So they're kind of part of the American cultural fabric in small amounts. I was always, you don't feel as though you're outside of America if you're in a church and a big percentage of it is black or Hispanic Americans, assuming they speak the language. That's not the same.
Yeah, it's different.
As being in a town that's all Somali, as being in a town that's all Indian. That doesn't feel like the United States.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about what just transpired here. And so essentially, Crowder starts by quoting Lee Kuan Yew's warning that multiculturalism will essentially be the destruction of America. And then he immediately, of course, agrees with that. Now, to be clear, multiculturalism can cause real problems. I don't want to be just oblivious to that. For example, when it creates parallel societies that refuse to share common values, you get fragmentation instead of unity. And that's obviously not a good thing. So not everything he says there is automatically wrong, right? I don't want us to kind of swing to the other direction and think that there's simply no risk to having multiculturalism. But here's what I do want you to watch, which is the pattern here. You see, the moment that he says, well, this doesn't mean no blacks or no browns, I actually want you to notice how he immediately pivots. Whenever he's speaking about black people, he immediately pivots to crime in the black community. Again, he doesn't mention jobs. He doesn't mention the church life. He doesn't mention culture. He instinctively just mentions crime as if that's just kind of like his knee-jerk reaction whenever he's speaking about black people. I don't know why we can't speak positively about black people, but I guess this is just kind of like, oh, you hit me up. Black people and crime. And so I don't know about you, but I find that absolutely fascinating because crime actually exists in white communities too. I think we all kind of forget that. We automatically assume, oh, crime, it's just equals black America. No, white Americans do crime too. But you see, he never uses white crime as a way to describe white people, now does he? Yet he uses black crime as a way to describe black people. And that should tell you something, right? That actually tells you everything you need to know about who he instinctively sees as the norm in this country and who he instinctively sees as the problem. And to make it even worse, he then goes on to make a comment that's very subtle, right? Most people probably listen to this, probably missed it, but it's actually extremely revealing. You see, essentially, he says that black Americans and Hispanic Americans, and I'm pretty sure he could have went down the list as well and mentioned Asian Americans, are kind of part of American cultural fabric in small amounts. Again, He doesn't just say that they are a part of American culture, right? Period. No, he says they're kind of part of American cultural fabric in small amounts. Now, if you don't know what he's saying there, in other words, what he's saying is that every other American is only acceptable so long as they remain in small amounts, as long as they remain in the minority. That's essentially what he's saying there. And then he completes the thought by saying, it's one thing to have a black church, right? You go to a church and it's majority black. That's one thing. But it's a whole nother thing whenever the whole city is majority black or Hispanic or Indian, right? At that point, well, that just doesn't feel like America. That just doesn't feel like United States. And so now we're getting to the crux of the issue. You see, if you remember from the earlier clip, Stephen hinted that visibility is actually the real issue he's after. That seeing large groups of Indians and Texans in Texas doesn't look like the America he knows. But now he makes the logic universal. You see, to him, it doesn't matter if the group is Somali or Somalian or Indian or black or Hispanic, right? If they occupy too much space, if their numbers grow too large, if their presence becomes too visible, in Stephen's opinion, then the place itself kind of stops being America. And so, as you can see, this isn't really about ideology anymore. It's not about crime. It's not about assimilation. It's about demographics, right? It's about whiteness as the baseline and everyone else as the acceptable group, but only in moderation. And here's why I want to point out yet another concerning aspect in Crowder's logic. You see, remember when he reduced entire populations to the moral failures of their governments? You remember that? Right? Well, if you actually follow that same logic just consistently to its logical conclusion, well, that's exactly how racists treat black Americans all the time, right? They look at black crime statistics, and then what they do is they just reduce all black people to the failures of some black people, right? And again, you see Stephen Crowder do this with the Somalians, right? The Somalians, not all of them are all of the horrible things that you find in Somalia, right? Or Somalia, but you wouldn't know that if you just listen to Stephen Crowder. You would think all of them are just barbaric, or Afghanistan's, or people from Iraq and things of that nature, right? Like, you would think that all of these people are just primitive. All these people are just jihadists. That's what you would think if you just listen to Stephen Crowder. And again, this is where you have to go back to CRT, because remember, with CRT, and Stephen Crowder rightly rejected CRT, CRT basically lumped all white people and said that all of them are racist, right? All of them are oppressors. And we rightly recognize that to be absolutely buffoonery. And yet here is Stephen Crowder doing the exact same buffoonery to everybody else. And so this is where we just need to step back and really just be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves this essential question. You see, what is actually being argued here? Because at this point, Crowder isn't defending us just having more secure borders, as we're seeing, right? He's defending demographic comfort. He's defending a certain racial picture of America. And he's doing it while telling his audience that it's not just understandable, it's actually correct. It's natural, right? Everybody else is doing it. You go ahead and do it. It's okay. That's what he's doing. And so now that we've walked through, all 4 clips of Stephen Crowder's buffoonery there, I think at this point we just need to pause and put the pieces together, because each moment on its own might look like Stephen Crowder is just being blunt or just being edgy or just telling it like it is. But when you actually step back and look at the pattern, you actually start to notice something much deeper happening beneath the surface. You see, clip after clip, Crowder starts with, what can be perceived as just a really legitimate concern, whether that be Islamic extremism or border security or assimilation or national cohesion, right? All of those issues definitely deserve their real conversation. All of those issues are completely legitimate. But then he repeatedly fuses those issues with something far broader, right? Which is a worldview where non-white populations are treated with suspicion by default, where their presence becomes a problem in and of themselves, where demographic change is framed as an existential threat, right? And he doesn't judge individuals, he judges groups. He doesn't distinguish between extremists and just ordinary families who are maybe seeking refuge. He doesn't care that people might be fleeing the very things that he is condemning here, right? He takes the failures of nations and then he maps them onto the very people themselves. And worst of all, he only applies that logic in one direction, right? White Americans, according to Stephen, are just individuals. Well, you have to judge white people based off of their individual persons. You can't group us all together, right? Some of us, like rock and roll. Some of us like hip hop. We're different. We're not all the same. Some of us are racist. Some of us are not, right? That's how Stephen sees white people. But see, everybody else is just demographic, right? White crime is, it's human nature. But black crime, that's the real problem in America, right? It's cultural. Right? Somali presence is a danger. Indian presence is just not America. Right? Hispanic presence is acceptable, but only in small amounts. And, once you see that pattern, it instantly becomes impossible to unsee it. You see, my friends, that is not patriotism. That is not even strong immigration policy. That's not even what America stands for. That is ethnocentrism wrapped in the language of national security. That's exactly what it is. And look, if you're a Christian, as Stephen Crowder proclaims to be, or even just someone who, wants to engage this issue honestly, you have to call this nonsense what it is. Because the moment you start dividing people into fully American or conditionally American groups, right, based on race or your comfort level, you've already abandoned the very principles that you claim to defend as Americans, my friends. And so now that we've seen the pattern, I want to shift gears and just talk about something far more important, which is this. How should Christians, if you're a Christian watching this, how should Christians think through immigration? Because, the solution isn't to ignore real dangers, and it isn't to pretend every worldview is equally good. It is not, right? We can still be very frank and honest about that reality. But the solution also isn't to collapse entire people groups into caricatures or decide someone's worth based on whether their presence makes a neighborhood feels American enough. You see, the Christian approach starts where Scripture starts, which is with the idea that every human being is made in the image of God. Now, to be clear, that doesn't erase the need for borders or laws or vetting or order, right? But it does completely rule out the idea that someone's ethnicity or appearance makes them, less worthy of dignity, right? And we also understand something Crowder never mentions in this whole entire episode, which is that the people are not their governments. Right? Scripture repeatedly distinguished wicked nations from the individuals inside those wicked nations. Right? God judged Egypt as a nation, but he saves Egyptians. He condemns Nineveh, again, as a nation, and then he sends Jonah to offer mercy to the people. Right? He gives Israel laws that simultaneously protect the nation's identity while also protecting the immigrant, the foreigner, the sojourner. Not because every foreigner was good, but because every foreigner was human. That's the point. And so what does that mean for us today? Well, it means we absolutely screen for extremism. We absolutely screen for crime. We absolutely protect our country from ideological threats. We do all of these things. But we do not assume extremism because of someone's ethnicity or because of someone's religion. We don't assume criminality because of someone's country of origin. We don't assume danger because someone doesn't look like the majority. If someone poses a threat, and I mean a real threat, you deal with that threat. But what you don't do is you don't turn the threat into a racial category, right? And that's where Steven Crowder's worldview collapses under its own weight, because again, he treats Muslims and Indians and Africans and Somalis and Hispanics as if their worth is entirely tied to how American they feel to him. And again, he's not going to say that verbally, but he has said it all throughout his actions. And my friends, that's not justice. That's not wisdom. And that's certainly not biblical, right? A Christian vision of immigration holds two truths together at once. First truth that it holds together is that the government, not the church, bears the sword, right? It's the government's job to protect its citizens, to punish evil, to maintain order. We see that very clearly in Romans chapter 13. And again, that includes things like vetting people, or controlling borders, or preventing dangerous ideologies from taking root in our nation. And so that's the first truth that we hold. And the second truth, which is equally important, is that the church bears the gospel, right? Our posture towards people isn't to fear them. It isn't to act on suspicious basis, or to give in to some type of demographic anxiety. Rather, it's to offer compassion and discernment, right? We don't flatten people into categories. We don't assume guilt by association. We don't treat someone's accent or skin tone as a signal of a threat, right? We can be wise without being tribal, is what I'm saying. We can be careful without being cruel. We can be sober-minded and just have common sense without becoming ethnocentric, right? Christians don't have to choose between security and dignity. Scripture commands us to uphold both. And that's the difference between Crowder's ideology and the Christian world, right? His solution is essentially demographic control, right? The Christian solution, though, is just moral clarity, right? It is national responsibility and it is personal dignity. That is what the Christian solution is, all in the same time. And so as we wrap this up, here's what I want to leave you with. You see, immigration is not a simple issue, right? It's emotional, it's political, it's personal, right? I get all that. And for a lot of families, it's literally life and death. But, the way we talk about it, guys, it matters just as much as the policies we support, because rhetoric shapes people, right? Rhetoric forms instinct. Rhetoric teaches us who to fear and who to trust. And what Crowder is doing here, ladies and gentlemen, in these clips, isn't helping us to think more clearly. It's actually just teaching us to think more narrowly. It's taking real concerns like extremism, like crime, like border chaos. And what he's doing is he's fusing them into racial anxieties, into vast group generalizations, into a vision of America that sees only certain people, i.e. white people, as American by nature. And everyone else is just, American by expectation. But that's not the truth. And that's not how we can survive as a nation, right? That's not wisdom, and that's certainly not the gospel. And so as Christians, we don't have the luxury of dehumanizing entire people groups just because it makes the conversation easier. No, we deal with people on an individual basis, right? We judge actions, not ancestry. We protect our nation without forgetting the worth of the people who want to enter it. And we recognize that if our definition of America can't make room for people who look vastly different from us, so long as they embrace the values that truly make this country work, then our definition wasn't patriotic to begin with. It was just ethnocentric. You see, immigration, my friends, requires wisdom. It requires courage, it requires honesty, and it requires compassion all at the same time. And that's the lane that we have to stay in, right? That's the lane that we have to operate within as Christians. We cannot afford ourselves to give in to this wicked impulse that Steven Crowder has just demonstrated for us. We just can't do it, right? But all right, guys, I can keep going on, but that's the video. Look, if this video was helpful, be sure to do all the great things, like, share, subscribe, as that really does help the channel out a lot. And as always, I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, guys, peace.